Okay, super glad to see you all back. Time to tackle these UV problems that we've left off with in the last lesson. So currently, we have identified some bad guess unwrapping that Blender has given to us. So before we fix it, I want to give you guys an idea of what bad unwrapping translates to when we start to texture our models. So to do that, let's make a small detour and go to the shading workspace on top. The shading workspace is where we create materials in Blender. So in the shading workspace, the viewport shading is set to the material preview is this one. You can see material preview is right there. And our entire model is this white color, which is Blender's default color when we preview a material, but no material has actually been applied onto it. We can confirm this by clicking this dual color tab over here, which is our materials tab. And regardless of what mesh that we click on anywhere, this space over here is going to be empty, which indicates to us that there are no materials set. So right now, I'm not going to give a comprehensive explanation on the creation of materials right now, since we're going to be discussing that in chapter 5. But right now, this is what we're going to do. So we're going to click new here in the shader editor. This will create a new material. And we'll just rename this to UV grid material right here in the little bar. Now with everything deselected, so just click somewhere to stop selecting these nodes. Just right click on an empty space, or you could Shift A to add. And we're going to add a texture and image texture. And just click somewhere empty to paste it. With this image texture selected, we're going to click new to create an image. We will name this UV grid preview. We're going to keep the resolution 1024 by 1024, but specifically we want to change the generated type to UV grid with the dropdown. But all that good, we're going to select new image, and we've created a UV grid image texture. To preview this on our actual model, we are going to take the color output of this node and drag off of it and drop it into the inputted base color of our principled BSDF node. We let go, and whichever mesh that you have applied, it's now showing up as a material on that specific mesh. So in this case, it's our walls plane. Now we want this material to be applied to the rest of our meshes, since they still have no materials because they're white. So we can do it here, one by one, but I'm actually going to head out back to the layout workspace because I like to have a fuller screen. Let's change the viewport shading back to material preview. And there's actually two ways of applying materials for the rest of it. The first way, which is the manual way, you just select a mesh without material, go to that materials tab, and use the drop down to select and apply that material that we want on it. But the second way to do it, which is a lot faster, is I could select all my crate related meshes or the ones I want that material to be applied to. So that's not my reference or axes. And then I can go to object, and you want to press the link or transfer data option. And then we want to select link materials. And what this does in Blender is it's going to talk amongst all these meshes, find what materials are common between them, talk to one another, and apply to the rest of them. And just like that, all of our meshes of importance have this UV grid texture. So with this detour finished and everything selected with A, let's go back to that UV editing workspace. So what do we notice? That preview that we have here, that we've just done, in the UV editor, it's actually taking that image that we created and automatically applied it on top of our grid. If this is not the case for you, the way that we preview the image behind this grid is in this drop-down menu at the top here. So I have my PNG for my crate, my reference, but I also have the image texture that I created. And that's the one that's selected on the top, which we've named UV Grid Preview. And specifically how this works is that all of these faces, whatever face is over whatever square over here, that is going to be the color of that face. And of course, if we want to see this, we need to make sure this is also in material preview shading. There we go. So what exactly does this tell us? We have this lovely checkered image texture that we want to apply to our crate. But our crate does not translate this lovely checkered image texture. Specifically, this is the result of UV distortion. And we're using this checkered image over here as a diagnosis, or to help us diagnose any distortion that we have. So for instance, if our checkers are stretched, which we could see in many places over here, like these squares are stretched, we have a couple stretching here and there. This indicates that some of the UVs might have been scaled incorrectly. If we have any squishing, which we could see even over here, that's why the plus sign is so elongated. This may indicate that the islands may be too compressed over here. And if we have any sort of warping, which we could see in many places, here, and a lot over here as well, this indicates that our seams or unwrapping are most likely misaligned. And as we have already figured out, our crate is a culprit to multiple distortion and overlap. And this image texture really confirms it. So we're going to fix this. Using this checkered pattern, our goal right now is to add good seams onto our mesh. We're going to move and then scale our islands so that we can recognize a checkered pattern onto our meshes. So we're going to start from the top. I'm going to go back to my layout and we're going to work through these meshes one by one. So the first thing on my outliner is the walls plane. So to make it easier for me to focus on this mesh, I want to go ahead and hide a bunch of the other ones. Now the easiest way to do that is to press A and hide everything, and we'll just go ahead and unhide our walls plane. And of course, if the distortion really bothers you and disrupts your workflow as you're placing your seams, you could always change your viewport shading back to something like solid to make it a little bit more manageable for you, and then just switch it back to check your work if anything. So just as a quick side tip, since I don't think I've explicitly talked about it yet, in edit mode, we have these blue lines, which we've seen before. These blue lines, or edges, are not seams. Instead, they are called sharps. And these are created from selecting one of these edges. And under Edge menu, we have Mark Sharp. And we also have a clear sharp to remove them as well. But these are also created sometimes using the shading smooth by angle option, which we've used a lot to get a nice smooth texture. So essentially, a sharp tells Blender to treat those edges as a sharp corner and not a smooth one. Anyways, finding appropriate seams can honestly be complicated. But the way I like to imagine it is, imagine you had a cardboard box with the shape, and somebody gave it to you and they asked you to just rip it up and lay it flat on the ground. How would you go about ripping it? So when I look at an object like this, the first thing I see is that with these holes in our side, I can sort of grab onto them and then just start ripping out these edges over here to sort of peel that flap apart. And I'm actually going to go ahead and do that for all of the sides. We could peel out this edge, then we can peel out this edge. So make sure that you're holding shift to select it, to select multiple edges at once. I like to do all of them at the end and just apply mark seams at once. But if you're worried about deselecting something at one time, you could always just apply some, continue your workflow. So apply some there. And let's apply it here. Okay, so with this side finished, I want to check my work. So I could do this by going to the UV editing workspace, like that. And I'm going to look for the mesh that I've placed my seams on, which is this one. So I'm going to press L on my keyboard to do a link select, like this. And I'm just making sure that all my seams are in place, which they are. And then I'm going to go back to the UV tab on the top here, press unwrap, and basically check my work. So let's see how much it improved. Okay, so don't worry too much about this funky option over here, since that's related to the one that we haven't looked at. But in the UV editor, I could see that everything seems to look pretty good. You know, the concept about ripping those edges apart seems to really translate well to get this amazing looking checkers. And I think you would agree that if this checkered pattern was like a wrapping paper for a present of this shape, you might have agreed that this is a very nice, even, neat job. Now, moreover, if you ever wrapped a present, you also try to find yourself that if you're cutting multiple pieces of wrapping paper, any one of those cuts that you made, you try to want to hide them as best as possible so it doesn't take away from the presentation. And a similar idea actually applies here too. You want to try to place your seams a little bit more inside so that when there are some separations over here where that cut is being made, you're most likely not going to have a smooth transition between the two. So by putting it on the inside, it sort of hides all that messy work. And we could see here this is evident because this checkered pattern on the left here sort of discontinues the pattern when we move on to these. Now, I purposely put the seams on the outer side of our crate, but I want you to keep this in mind because we're going to take that idea and do it correctly for the other side. So let's do that. So back over here, this mirrored wall has the same geometry, but depending on the complexity of your seams, you could either just manually apply it on this mirrored mesh, which I'm going to do since we only have 4 nice ones. But you can also delete this mesh, and because this is a mirrored modifier, just reapply that mirror and apply it, and the seams will be automatically placed. Okay, but if you're going back down that route, depending on what mirroring that you're using, or any sort of other modifiers that contribute to your work, if you're ever worried about extra vertices, you could always just go down that merge vertices by distance path afterwards as a small precaution. In this case, this one mirrored mesh is not very complicated, so I could just apply all of these manually again. And this time I'm going to apply it on these inner edges over here so that they are not as obvious on the outside. And of course, if you ever make a mistake like how I did, just press Ctrl-Z and hopefully select it correctly the second time. Right, and this is also a nice little way to practice maneuvering around and viewing your meshes at different angles. Let's mark those seams and let's check it out. So we'll select both now, UV unwrap. Both of them are looking good. All right, next we have the walls vented. So let's bring that to our center of attention. And we can see that obviously that the shape is very similar to my walls plane. So I'm going to mark seams on the inner edges over here to start off with. Okay. All of my seams have been placed on the same edges, but on the inner ones as well. But now we also have the flap in the middle. And the way I want to tackle this is I could sort of cut along these inner edges over here, put some seams there, so then I could push that middle piece outwards like its own little flap. And yes, as you could see as a result, a seam and a sharp can be marked on the same edge, despite if it only shows one of the colors. Well, in this case, it's showing red. But just know that both of these edges are both a seam and a sharp. Okay, and we'll do the same thing for this side. There we go. Now, with that, I expect the result to be very similar to the walls plane over here. So I'm actually going to do the walls vents one time as well. So let's bring in those walls vents to tackle with, like this. Now, in this case, I have a lot of them. So, because I have a lot of them, it might be easier for you to configure only one of them and just mirror the rest back. So, to do this, we are going to go into edit mode. I'm going to press A to select everything, but then I want to deselect the one with the origin attached to it, because that was the one that initially had all the, what was initially referenced for our array and mirror modifiers. So I could press Shift on my keyboard to deselect all of these faces. I just have 4 of them. Now the rest that I want to delete are selected. I'll press the vertices, because with the vertices gone, no edges or faces can be made as well. And the statistics also reflect that as well. And on this singular vent tile, I'm going to add a seam to the most hidden edge, which is this one right here in the back. Okay, with that done, I want to add my mirrors back. So let's bring in the walls vent just to get an idea of what it looked like again. Go back to my mirror modifiers. My modifiers tab, let's put that array. So my array, I believe we had a negative 1.1 the z-axis, so it's going downwards. And at this point, let's just bump up the count until it fills it again. And right here, 13 looks good. So I'll go ahead and apply that. And we'll also do the mirror modifier. So set the mirror object, and it's being reflected across the y-axis, which puts it over here. Apply that as well. And if we go into edit mode, all of the seams have been placed for us, which is nice. Okay, so with all of the wall related meshes completed, let's open them all up back. Actually, we don't have to do the plain one because we've already configured that. So with these two meshes, let's go ahead and preview it. So I'm going to select both of them, which I need to do in object mode first, then UV editing. Select both of them, and I'm going to press unwrap. And I can see for the most part, these faces are pretty nice. Everything looks to be good except for these faces over here. And this is probably because that these edges are a little bit more diagonal, so the squares are kind of moving inwards, which is not really ideal. So I can try to figure out this process to work well with the manual UV and wrap option, but once we're here, we could also see what the smart UV project is going to look like. So let's go ahead and click that smart UV project. Let's put a small island margin of that 0.01 just to separate all the faces away from each other. And if we do that, we could see that it's looking a lot better now. You know, Blender found a way to add these faces in a way that doesn't cave the checker tile upon these faces a little bit inwards. And honestly, I'm super happy about this one. So we'll keep it as well, and the tiles also look pretty good as well. Okay, so with the wall-related meshes completed, we're going to move on to the edge-related ones. So we're going to start off with the bottom edges. So for the bottom edges, I can imagine in edit mode if we cut out this side over here. Let me go into edge select mode. If we cut along this edge over here, we could sort of unfold the entire thing into one giant rectangle almost. So let's start with that. So the easiest way to do that is you could press Alt on your keyboard and select one of these edges, and it's actually going to recognize that all of these edges here are connected. Now to select the other ones at the same time, you could hold Alt and select it, but you also want to hold Shift as well so that you don't lose any of the previous selections that you have. Otherwise, it's going to overwrite it. And there we go. So mark seams. So that's pretty good. Now for the top edge connector, I think the best thing to do is we want to split around these holes by making edges along these lines here. So if we do that for around the section, that might help, but I'm not actually going to do it on all four sides because I don't want to separate the top from the bottom. So I'll keep this one over here, and it's sort of going to act like a flap. So we'll mark the seams there. Now for the top edge connectors, these smaller pieces on the side here, they're very similar to the bottom edges, so I'm going to treat those a similar way. So let's do that quickly. Like that. And for the middle piece here, it's sort of like a rectangular prism. So I'm going to make seams to cut open what I would imagine a rectangular prism to look like. So let's add some here. Oh, I have this one selected on the bottom, so let's try that again. Add some there, and then also some over here. Okay, and I want to do the same thing for the rest of them. There we go. Now we have all the middle pieces configured as well. Now the rectangular prism one was a little bit easier to think about because it's very similar to that cube example that we did in the previous lesson as well. Okay, and also just to keep in mind that the seams that I'm making may not always necessarily be a complete set of seams. Sometimes you might just want to put a couple of them just to get the ball rolling for Blender, and you're also relying a little bit on Blender's guesswork to figure out the remaining few stitches. Now I'm doing it this way because we are beginner Blender users, and I don't expect all of us to be, experts at determining orthographic or 2D projections. But if you wanted to take that step further, and as your own little personal game to figure out how to mark the seams accordingly, then by all means, that's awesome. Go for it. However, if you're still struggling with this a little bit, I would say until you're comfortable to reach that point, try to use a mixture of a couple of seams and Blender's interpretations as well. And honestly, use the UV editing tool as your little debugging tool. Anyways, for my vertical edges, I'm going to showcase that guesswork a little bit. I think for these edges, I'm just going to cut the back open over here since these ones are hidden to the user. Like this. And to show that as an example, we'll keep it like this for now. And of course, for the flaps on the inside, we are going to cut these open out. Like this. So this is another instance where you could also use the mirror modifier to just mirror back all the work that you did in one of the meshes, but we're already halfway done, so I'm just going to continue the manual way. I would say that it's also good to mention one time that as you're working through this, you're also practicing moving around Blender, but you also want to keep in mind that you don't want to accidentally miss a seam, otherwise you'll have some inconsistency problems. All right, so all of that is good now. That's good. And honestly, we'll do the edge vents one time. So all my edge vents. So again, this is another good example where you could just do one and mirror it. But I think I can quickly knock out everything manually. Sometimes Blender's zooming in might get a little buggy for you. So you want to zoom back out sometimes. You know, switch up your angles and it'll fix itself. All right, one more. And honestly, it might have been a lot faster to use the mirror modifiers, but it's okay. We're doing things a mixture of the manual and the easy way. So let's mark those seams, check around briefly. Everything looks pretty good. Okay, and now with all of the edge related stuff selected, which are these 4 edge meshes plus the vents, let's go ahead and check our work. So press A to select everything, UV editing, and select everything, UV unwrap. And this is what we're going to get. So specifically, I just want you to pay attention to the outer faces here, because these are the ones that are going to be the most visible to the user. Now, the bottom and vertical edge vents are the ones to be somewhat okay. But we do have a lot of instances where there are some slanting throughout. And we also have a couple of distortion and warping going on in some instances, which is a little bit unfortunate. But not all hope is lost yet. We also have our handy Smart UV project to see how that looks as well. And with the same settings applied, I'll hit OK. And we have a bunch of islands over here. But more importantly, it's looking pretty nice over here. So I think we're going to keep this as well. It looks a lot cleaner and it saves the work for us. Now at this point you might be thinking, the Smart UV project is pretty good at doing its job. Why not always just stick with it? And honestly, there's nothing wrong with just that. And even I use that option majority of the time. At the same time, you also need to make sure that you're doing something that makes the most sense to your project. For instance, we know that the Smart UV project results, one connected mesh will actually have several islands scattered around it because of that island marginal value that we set. However, in the manual unwrap option, meshes that are connected are also going to stay connected and show up in the UV editor. The latter might be helpful for you if you choose, when it comes time to painting or applying textures, if you choose to paint it in an external painting software like Krita or even Photoshop, or you find it a lot easier to paint along one smooth surface rather than just bits and pieces everywhere. Now in this course, we're not going to be using any external software, but just know that you have the option to do so for your own models. For now, we're just going to keep this as it is since it looks good and I'm pretty happy with it. All right. Next, we're going to move on to the corners. Now this one might be a little bit faster to do in mirrors again. So you want to locate the one with the origin, which is this one over here, and deselect it. So I'm holding Control on my keyboard and dragging it to deselect all of these faces. Right? Some of them might still be hidden, but just make sure that you have everything. And you will know that you have everything or if you missed anything if you press delete, vertices and some pieces are missing. So then you could just manually deselect it. Anyways, the corner that we have is very similar to the shape of a cube. So I'm going to create cuts for this cube that, make sense for a cube. So a cube, we're going to create some cuts along here and even in the back here as well. So this is exactly similar to what we did to the example cube in the last lesson. We had manual seams placed similarly. Now for these flaps in the middle, we're going to treat it the same as like the walls vented, where we're going to select a couple of these inner edges just to create these little flaps. All right, that corner is done. And I guess before we go ahead and apply all the other meshes with the mirror modifier, there's no harm in checking the work for one corner first, in case we need to tinker it, and then it saves our time from deleting everything again. So unwrap, and it gives us this result. Now this result is actually pretty good, because we can identify a nice checkered pattern going on here. And the only reason that it's slanted is because it's showing up slanted over here. Now, we're not worrying about rotation right now. We're worrying about if we can recognize a checkered pattern, which we absolutely can. So honestly, this is very, very good. Now, because this is so good, we'll go back to object mode and apply the mirror modifier with the same settings and apply it. So if you go back to, if we select it again, UV editing, and unwrap all of it together, all of it shows up nicely, like this. And of course, we imagine that the scale of everything to be a little bit smaller, because we now have multiple meshes that are trying to compete for space in this grid. Of course, if you don't like this rotation that's going on here, we could always check the Smart UV Project option in case you like this result better. So choose whichever one works for you. I'm going to keep this version for now. So the versions I'm keeping right now aren't going to be too important since we want to apply a final and wrap when everything's done, but that's a later discussion. We still got to move on a little bit. Next, we're going to the bottom piece. So the bottom piece, this is quite similar to the top edge connector, but we realized that the top edge connector didn't look so good, and we used the Smart UV Project. So we're just going to do the same thing here. So select it, Smart UV Project, and everything looks good. So in case you're forgetting, the Smart UV Project, it's calculating its own seams based on its own algorithm, practically the ones that you create. So all the seams that we created so far for our own practice, some of which we figured out to be a lot better than others. So we're kind of using both of them in tangent. Now the last thing are the screws. Now we do have a lot of the screws, but they're all the same shape. So we'll do one and then just mirror it back. So for the vertical screws, we're going to locate the one with the origin and deselect all of the faces like that. Delete the vertices to get rid of the rest. And this is an actual quite easy shape to work with, because we can just make cuts along each of these edges over here and sort of open this up into like a little hexagonal flower. Like that. That's good. Let's do the wall screws one time as well. So there's my one with the origin. So we'll deselect that, delete the rest, and we will apply seams similarly in edge select mode. For small meshes like this, you might notice that the sensitivity of your controls might go a little bit up. So just take your time, be careful with the moving especially, but I have confidence that you will manage it. There we go. So seams are created. Let's just apply everything back. So for our vertical edge screws, we had oh no, I'm applying it to the wall screws. Okay, let's do that. So wall screws, we had these in place, so we'll apply it. And then we also had the rotation as well. So these are our wall screws, and for the vertical one, we had these settings, so X and Y with the rot 0 axis, and then we also rotated that as well. There we go. So these are all my vertical screws, these are all my wall screws. So all the screws selected, let's go ahead and see the work that we've done. We go ahead and unwrap, and we get a nice checkered pattern that's showing up. So we did a good job here. So with everything done, we are going to go ahead and unhide everything. So we can Alt H to unhide everything. I'll go ahead and hide the ones that are unrelated. So my reference, my axes, and if you have any reference meshes, hide those as well. And let's go see what we're able to achieve. So press A to select everything, and let's go to the UV editing workspace. So the first thing is that we notice is that the crate itself might look disorienting to look at. But the truth is we do have a properly UV unwrapped model. You can see that everywhere that we looked, in its own discipline, we could recognize a checkered pattern. The only problem left is, if we select everything and we take a look at this UV editing workspace, there is a ton of overlap. This is because that when we were going through this process, we were unwrapping things one by one. And in each of those instances, that unwrapping tried to take up the most space that it could on this UV grid. So if you do it for all the walls, they took up a bunch of space. We did it for the edges, they tried to compete for that same space, but it didn't look for what space hadn't been taken up. That only happens if we try to do all the unwrapping all at once. So how can we solve this issue? Because we have a lot of the work already done for us, in the UV editor over here, we're going to go select UV and select Pack Islands. Now, packing islands refers to the process of taking all of our islands and packing them, or sorting them, or organizing them inside of this grid in a nice, clean, efficient way. With the scale and rotate settings enabled, pack islands will try to scale and rotate our islands so that everything fits nicely in our grid, whilst keeping this marginal distance between them. Now, I think 0.001 is quite small. I might bump it up to 0.01 just for a little bit more wiggle room. And after that's finished, press OK. And depending on your PC, it might take some time. But Blender has packed all of our islands together very nicely. Now, we can still tweak this result a little bit later if we choose to scale, rotate, or move any of these islands. But the importance of doing all this tweaking is going to be discussed in the next chapter when we start creating materials for this crate. So everyone, I just want to congratulate you for getting through another chapter, and honestly, you should be super proud of yourself because you're learning professional tools and workflows for optimized game-ready props. Now, ultimately, UVs can be a little bit finicky, boring, and troublesome to work with. So whenever you do use UVs in the future, here's a small little checklist to keep you handy. So, if you have any stretched checkered pattern anywhere, you would likely need to scale UV islands evenly. So that's a scaling problem. If you have weird seams or cuts, reevaluate your seam placement or just use Smart UV Project. If you have UVs outside of this grid area, select it and move it back inside of the grid area. Finally, if you have any overlapping islands anywhere, separate them and repack. Of course, we don't need to be perfect here. We just need to understand what's going on, what's going wrong, and how do we fix it. So, with our crate all nice and ready for materials, I hope I'm going to see all of you in the final chapter. I know final already, right? That's pretty crazy. And we're going to be giving our crate a little bit of personality. So thank you, and I'll see you there.